Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Did any of you see or hear anything about this case in the media? I see no hands. Please raise your hand if anyone has attempted to speak with you about this case other than court staff or the attorneys during the proceeding. I see no hands. Ms. Wilmot, you may call your rebuttal witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Defense calls Dr. Robert Geffner.
Sir, please come forward right up here to be sworn.
Raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Sir, please walk right around and have a seat. Thank you. You're going to need that bar right in front of you when you speak. That is the microphone. Thank you. You may proceed.
I'll let you pour some water first.
Thank you.
Good morning. Can you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
I'm Robert Geffner.
And Dr. Geffner, you are a doctor, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a PhD?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And can you tell us a little bit about your education and training to get that PhD?
Well, I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry, which isn't related to my PhD. Then I have a master's degree in psychology from San Jose State University. Then I have a doctorate, a PhD in psychology from the University of California at Santa Cruz.
And after you received your doctorate, did you get a license to practice?
Well, I first had to have postdoctorate training and supervision. Then I received my license. I was an assistant professor in Texas, and so I was licensed as a psychologist in 1980, but I had been licensed prior to that as a marriage and family therapist in California when I was working on my doctorate degree.
Okay. And when you're licensed as a marriage and family therapist, is that with a master's?
Yes.
Okay. And so while you're working on, once you get your doctorate and you do your postdoc work, that's when you get your license as a psychologist?
Yes. I mean, you have to do various things. You have to pass tests. You have to document your training, and then you can apply and become licensed.
All right. And you did that in 1980?
Yes, I was licensed in Texas as a psychologist first in 1980.
Okay. And are you licensed as a psychologist anywhere else?
Yes.
Where else?
I'm now licensed in California. When I relocated to California about 14, 15 years ago, then I became licensed in California. I think I got that license in 1999.
All right.
So I'm still licensed in both states.
Okay. So how long have you been practicing as a psychologist?
As a psychologist, 33 years.
And is there a difference when you say practicing? When can you say that you've been practicing as a psychologist?
Once you receive a license, well, as a psychologist, you have to be licensed then as a psychologist, and then you can call yourself a psychologist, and that's when you can practice in a variety of settings or on your own. If you're licensed in another profession, then you can call yourself that profession, and then you can be in practice from that standpoint.
And can you say that, can you count the time that you used to get your training and supervision to ultimately get your license? Can you count that as practice time?
Not officially. You cannot practice in a mental health professional until you have some type of license, and then you can only call yourself by that license. So, for example, licensed as a marriage and family therapist, once I get that license, I can call myself a marriage and family therapist. Once I get a psychologist license, I can call myself a psychologist, and then I can practice. Practice could be on my own, it could be for a clinic, it could be for an agency.
Well, tell me what it is that you're currently employed with.
I have a variety of titles. I am the president and founder of the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma at Alliant International University. I'm housed in San Diego. The university actually has 7 campuses around the state of California, plus in programs in 3 other countries. And I'm also a research professor of psychology at Alliant International University. My actual title is Distinguished Research Professor. I was promoted from clinical to distinguished. That's the highest level. That was about a year ago. So I'm a professor there. Those are the things I get paid for, but I'm also the founder and president of the Family Violence and Sexual Assault Institute, which I started in East Texas 29 years ago, but I don't get paid for that. It's like volunteer work.
Okay. And so how long have you been working then with the Alliance University?
Alliant International University I started with when I relocated back to Southern California. 1999, so it'd be about 14 years there, being a research professor, training doctorate students. In the early years, I actually taught some of the courses. Now I supervise still.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your responsibilities? You're telling us that you supervise. What is it exactly as the president and founder that you do, and professor?
Well, I have a variety of responsibilities. The nonprofit institute has several components. We have a training component, we have a publications component, we have a policy component, we have what we call a direct services. That means actually providing services to clients or working on cases like this. We also have a nonprofit bookstore. We provide continuing education to professionals in a variety of disciplines like attorneys, psychologists, social workers, marriage and family therapists, etc.
Let me ask you about that. How do you provide continuing education?
We're well, two ways. We're an accredited agency nationally and in states. So that means if we co-sponsor or actually put on a training, then people who attend it can get what's called continuing education units or hours, which is required for most licenses. So attorneys, psychologists in most states are required to have a certain number of hours of continuing education each year. So we're an agency essentially that can provide those hours. So that's the continuing education. We actually put on trainings ourselves. So we have 2 conferences that we actually, meaning my staff, put on, one large one in September each year in San Diego, which is the International Conference on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. That goes for almost a week with various trainings, and it brings in anywhere from 1,200 to 1,400 people from all over the United States and from other countries. So we actually host and put that on with national planning committees.
I'm sorry.
We also put on a regional trauma conference every year. That one is in Hawaii. We're in the 10th, this will be our 11th year next year for the trauma conference. The international conference is now, this year will be its 18th year. So those are major events, but we do trainings throughout the country and in other countries, either myself or others that we're associated with.
You mentioned trainings with for lawyers, other psychologists. Do you ever train have medical doctors
Yes.
for training?
Yes.
And what about judges?
Yes.
What kind of training do you do for judges?
For about 10 years, I was the lead psychologist for the National Judicial College. That's the main entity in the United States to train judges in a variety of areas. They're located in Reno, Nevada. So judges come there from all over the country and spend anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks being trained in different topic areas. My areas of the training were in domestic violence, child abuse, diagnostic assessment, use of expert witnesses, how to make appropriate referrals, things like that. So I worked usually with 3 judges, and those trainings usually went for a week. So judges from all over the country would come. And then I've also done them for a variety of states that brought me in to train judges on particular topic areas. Most often domestic violence or child abuse or aggression or violence or trauma, risk assessment, how to deal with repeat offenders, the dynamics of these different types of forms of violence and abuse. Those would all be topic areas that I would be brought in to train people on.
You mentioned that your organization is a nonprofit organization.
Yes.
What does that mean as far as, because we know that you're here as an expert, what does that mean as far as, do you get paid for what you're doing?
Well, I'm on salary for the Institute. As president of the Institute, I have a fixed salary. All my staff are salaried. So we don't get paid for anything in particular. So working on the cases we work on or doing the trainings or those things doesn't change our salaries. And unfortunately, our salaries have been frozen for the last few years, but it doesn't change. No, I don't get paid. I don't get any money myself for the work we do on these things.
Okay, so in other words, coming here, are you getting anything extra into your salary this year because you've come here to testify?
No.
You talked about you mentioned some of the training that you train. Who is it that you train?
Variety of professionals depending on what we're asked.
I'm sorry, I meant supervise. We talked about training.
That's right. Very good.
I'm sorry, supervise. Who is it that you supervise?
Right now, I supervise a variety of people. Part of my position at the university as a research professor is I have what's called a research group. That means there are people who are working on their doctorate degrees in clinical or forensic psychology who meet with me each week, and they have to do research projects. They're called dissertations. So I supervise 12 doctorate students right now who are working on their dissertation. They would have to, in order for them to be in my group, they have to be doing research on some areas of my expertise. So it would be like trauma or violence or abuse or aggression or neuropsychology or forensic psychology, family psychology, something along those lines. Then they would be in my group. So one area of focus for me would be the supervision of the doctorate students for research. The second part is the clinical part. As I mentioned, one of the other components of our institute is direct services. Means we actually treat clients in our local region or people who come into our institute because they've been traumatized, either victims or offenders or children or families, all sorts of issues in the mental health arena we have a treatment for. So right now, and each year actually, there are 2 doctorate students who are getting their degrees in either clinical or forensic psychology that could be from our university or other universities. We're state recognized, meaning people can apply to be in our internship programs virtually from anywhere. So we have 2 interns that work with us each year. So the ones I have now will finish in June and the new set will come in July. So I supervise them for clinical practice. We train them on a variety of issues in clinical and forensic psychology. And then I have a postdoctorate fellow. This is a person who's already received his or her doctorate degree, and they're now doing the supervised training after their doctorate toward their licensure. So we have a postdoctorate fellow now, and we have another one who will again start in the summer. So each year we have a new group that comes in. And then we have other psychologists and professionals that come to us for specific training. So there's now a licensed social worker and another licensed psychologist who already practice in different areas of the state of California, and they come to us once a week so they can be trained, for example, in doing child custody evaluations, another area we focus on. So in addition to overseeing the staff of the Institute, then those would be people I supervise officially.
Okay. You mentioned the postdoctorate fellow that you have. Now, so after somebody gets their doctorate, you were talking about needing to have so many hours before they can actually apply for their license.
Yes.
Are you familiar with the way that the state of Arizona works when somebody is applying to get their license?
Yes.
And how does it work once you get your doctorate for someone to get their license?
Upright.
You said that you are familiar with the way the licensing works in Arizona?
Yes, pretty much.
Okay. And specifically with regard to getting once somebody has their postdoctorate, so they have their doctorate degree, and prior to applying for their license. Are you familiar with how many hours Arizona requires of supervised work?
Objection, lack of foundation.
You may answer yes or no.
Yes.
Okay. And what is, based on your knowledge of that, how many hours does the person have to have supervised before they can apply for their license?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Sustained.
Judge, may we approach?
You may proceed.
Dr. Guffner, when you say that you're familiar with the way Arizona works as far as the number of hours a person needs to get after their doctorate to the time they get licensed, how is it that you know this?
Well, there's two ways. One is because we deal with postdoctorate fellows from all over the country who apply to us to work at our center. The American Psychological Association publishes a guide each year on what licensure requirements are needed in each state. So that way the people we supervise we can work with. So people go back to different states. For example, we've had people go back to Massachusetts, we've had people stay in California, we have people go to Texas. So they publish a guide on what's required. That's the first thing.
Okay.
Second is there are two states that we've been doing more work than in other states, Arizona and Hawaii. So we've actually looked at what it would take for me to get licensed in both those states. And so we looked at the requirements in the licensing board acts themselves. That's what tells you what the state requires. So both those ways are the way somebody like me or somebody else can decide or find out what the requirements are.
Okay, so based on that information that you have, do you have an understanding of how many hours a person would need or what it takes to get a license, I guess, for psychology after their doctorate?
Yes, there's two ways. One is the normal way after you get your doctorate is 1 year roughly of postdoctorate supervised experience by another licensed psychologist. Almost all states, including Arizona, put a number of hours. 1,500 hours is what's required, for example, in California and Arizona. So they take an exam, usually two, one that's national, that actually tests you on your knowledge of psychology, and another tests you on your knowledge of the ethical codes in that particular state, etc. Once you pass that and you've had your number of hours of supervised experience has been documented, you can apply for your license in Arizona or in other states.
All right. So
That's one typical way.
That's somebody who's just receiving their doctorate. That's
Correct.
how it's typical.
Yes.
So if somebody just received their doctorate, is there any possible way in Arizona that they could be licensed immediately?
Not to my knowledge.
All right. So they would still have to do that 1,500 hours of postdoctorate supervision work?
Yes.
What's the other way? If somebody like you, if you want to become licensed in Arizona, is there another way to do it?
Yes, if you've licensed in another state, then each state has what's called reciprocity. They have requirements of how you can transfer or obtain an additional license in another state. If you have what is called a diplomate from the American Board of Professional Psychology, then many states honor that, and that with another license, assuming no ethical complaints have been validated against you, you can apply, and then you don't have to do exams and you don't have to do the others. They assume because of those credentials that you've met the criteria, and that's what we're looking at with both Arizona and Hawaii.
All right. And you mentioned diplomate. What is that?
In the mental health profession, for example, for me, licensure is one level of ways of verifying amount of experience and credentials and experience. It's a level of recognition. There are levels of recognition beyond licensure. There are certifications somebody can get, and then the highest level in the mental health field is termed diplomate. Diplomates have very specific requirements of what you have to do in training, experience, and process to obtain a diplomate.
What kind of things do you have to do?
For me, you had to be 5 years after your doctorate, 5 years after licensure. You had to have, it's an area of specialization, so you had to actually have training in that area of specialization. You had to be able to document the supervised training. Then there's normally some type of examination. For me, and what's customary is a 3-hour oral examination by a committee of people who already have the diplomates, and that happens after a committee has reviewed your credentials, experience, and work, what's called work product. You have to send samples of your work to them to be able to have them verify that you actually know what you're talking about and that you do have this specialized training. So when you've done all that, then you can receive a diplomate.
Okay. So as I understand it then, a diplomate is something that is a specialized training of something in particular under psychology.
Yes, there are diplomates for different areas of specialization that somebody can apply for.
All right. How many diplomates do you have?
I have 2.
All right, so let's talk about one of them. What's one of them?
One is in family psychology. So I have a specialization in family psychology, and the way it's termed, for example, on my vita or credentials is I'm board certified in family psychology.
And so what does that mean for the rest of us? If you're board certified in family psychology, what does that mean you can do?
Theoretically, it means that you can trust, because I've been evaluated by those who have the expertise, that I know something about that field, that I have met the specialized training requirements and supervision and have the credentials. So it's a way for the public or others to be able to be somewhat assured that this person has that kind of training, because a licensed psychologist, for example, doesn't really tell you if I'm trained in clinical psychology, am I trained in family psychology, am I trained in neuropsychology, am I trained in industrial psychology. It just says I'm licensed as a psychologist, and then theoretically you're supposed to practice in your areas. But for somebody else looking at that, it doesn't tell you if this person actually has specific training or specializations.
So the diplomate tells us that you have a specific training. What's the other diplomate that you have?
Neuropsychology, clinical neuropsychology.
Okay. And with that diplomate, that tells us you have a specialty in neuropsychology then, right?
That is correct.
All right. And how often do you have an idea of or knowledge about how often psychologists have diplomates? Is this something common that a lot of people have?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Sustained.
Do you have an understanding, based on your training and experience in dealing with other psychologists and the number of years that you have worked as a psychologist, do you have an understanding as to whether or not many psychologists or few psychologists have diplomates?
Objection, lack of foundation.
So yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, how do you have that understanding?
The American Psychological Association, which is involved in one of the major organizations nationally that is at least involved with diplomates. The actual one with them, there are a variety of recognized boards. One is the American Board of Professional Psychology, and they they publish information each year on how many diplomates there are and in what different areas. So from that, we know what percentage of psychologists have one diplomate, and then there's also information on how many have more than one.
Okay, so based on that information, what's the percentage of people who have one diplomate, psychologists?
In the field of psychology, it is just a few percent. In other words, less than 5% of those who are licensed and practice as psychologists have a diplomate in one or another area of specialization.
And what happens to that percentage when we talk about somebody who has 2 diplomates like you do?
It drops way down. Less than 1% of psychologists have 2 or more diplomates.
All right. How long, part of the component where you, at the Institute, you said is forensic work, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and how long is it that you've been doing forensic work?
30 years.
Okay, and what does that mean? What does that encompass when you tell us you're doing forensic work?
Well, theoretically, there's 2 types. One is training. You can do forensic work by training others, meaning work tied into a court one way or another. So there's criminal cases like this one. There are civil cases where somebody is suing somebody else. There are family law cases. So forensic work means somehow dealing with the legal system, courts, etc. So you can be involved in the forensic arena because of training others, or you can actually practice. Practice means either as a psychologist, you may be in court testifying about clients you treat. You can also be in court testifying as, quote, an expert witness. If you have an area of specialization, you can be in court to educate a judge or a jury about particular areas. So that's another way. Or you can actually be what's called a forensic evaluator, where you are actually evaluating a person or a case specifically for court. So all those are possible.
All right. And what type of forensic work have you done?
All of those.
Okay. Have you testified before?
Yes.
Do you have an idea about how many times you've testified in the last 30 years?
I would estimate probably, as overall, because different years change, at least 150 times.
Okay. And when you've testified before, are they always for criminal cases?
No, it varies. In my earlier days, for example, in the 1980s and 1990s, I would say I probably testified in more criminal cases than civil, but we also testified in others, in state court, in federal courts, in various states. In more recent years, not as much criminal, much more civil or family law. It just varies. Everything is word of mouth. We don't advertise. So it just, whatever happens to come to us, it just rotates around. I could go months without testifying, and then just coincidentally, I might testify 2 or 3 times within a month on completely unrelated cases in different states.
Okay. And so some of those, you said family law, is that things like child custody or things like that?
Yes, exactly. Or it could be domestic violence or child abuse related to either custody or just related to the abuse. Or it could be in a juvenile dependency court because of child abuse or domestic violence. Or it could be in a criminal case. So that topic area could be in almost any court. It just depends on what the particular case is about, and if somebody is suing somebody or if somebody is charged with a crime. Could be either way.
Okay. And what about capital cases? Have you been called to testify for capital cases, cases involving the death penalty?
Yes.
And do you have an idea how many times you've done that? And roughly, if you don't know the exact number.
I probably have, can't remember exactly how many I've testified. I may have to change my estimate of how many times I've testified, because I think I've actually testified in near 100 capital cases in my 30 years. It's not 30, testified in near 100 capital cases, civil cases and others. I probably have to go over 200 times I've probably testified. A lot more capital cases in the past than more recently.
So that's something, capital cases is something that you haven't done as recently? Is that what you mean?
Correct. I think the last capital case I testified in was probably about 10 or so years ago. I think it was in Louisiana or somewhere there. When I relocated, I'm not sure people found me or know where I am. I just haven't been asked to do capital cases. So we do, as I said, we do whatever comes into our clinic or into our service. We don't promote or advertise.
And when you've been retained on capital cases, what kind of work are you typically doing for those capital cases?
Usually one of two things. In many of those cases, we actually evaluated the defendant. That means in those 100 cases or more, there's more cases, but I didn't always testify.
Okay.
But we actually would do complete psychological evaluations, neuropsychological evaluations, interviews of those defendants. And then in other cases, it would be as an expert witness, where I did not evaluate, but I would review records or be asked about specific areas of interest in the case.
When you say evaluating defendants, does that mean that you're being used as a witness for the innocent phase of the trial?
Well, it varies. Actually, quite a few of the cases were what's called case in chief. Even though we weren't involved in innocence or guilt, they would have us testify as to the person's functioning, like if they were victims of domestic violence or drug history or other things in the case itself. But we wouldn't be involved virtually at any of these cases in whether somebody was innocent or not. It would be what's called mitigating factors. Are there things that went on with this person that might be a reason or help understand why what happened happened? That would be more, but sometimes we would testify in the regular case. Sometimes they would bring us in and we would testify about our evaluation if they were found guilty in the second phase, which is the sentencing phase. It just varied depending on the attorneys and what they preferred.
Okay. And in the times that you have been, well, since you've been licensed, have you ever had any type of disciplinary action?
No.
What about, have you ever had any ethics committee or a licensing committee reprimand you or found complaints to be valid complaints of any kind?
No.
All right, so some of the things that you have experience in and has to do with testing, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and in this particular matter, in preparing to testify, did you review different assessment tests?
Yes.
What did you review?
Reviewed and, well, some we reviewed, some we rescored ourselves.
Okay. Well, did you review an MMPI-2 results?
Yes, I did.
And did you rescore those yourself?
Yes, I did.
And did you review MCMI or the Milan test? Did you review that?
Yes, I did.
And have you reviewed a post-traumatic stress test?
Yes, I did.
And that's called the PDS?
That is correct.
And have you reviewed a trauma inventory test?
Yes, and rescored that one as well.
Okay. And that's called the TSI, right?
That is correct. Well, it's the TSI-1.
TSI-1. And how many TSI-1s did you review?
2.
And in any of your work, did you ever speak with Ms. Arias yourself?
No, I did not.
And did you ever review any records with regard to Ms. Arias? And let me say, like police reports or that type of thing?
I did not.
All right. So did you contain your review basically to the assessments that were done, that were by others? That
and the report and information from Dr. DeMarte.
Okay. And, okay. So let's talk about testing for a moment.
Yes, ma'am.
What kind of training or what kind of experience do you have with these types of tests?
A variety. In graduate school, we're trained in some of the tests. I mean, that was a long time ago. I obviously wasn't trained in the trauma symptom inventory because it wasn't in existence when I was in graduate school. But, and it was the MMPI-1, not the 2. So part of it is trained in graduate school to do testing. Then part of the practice after that continues that. One of my areas of specialization was diagnostic assessment. So I had quite a bit of and continuing education and still do in different types of assessments. When I was in Texas after my doctorate, I became an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Tyler. And then I moved up over the years to full professor.
And let me stop you. In Texas, this is before California, right? This is before where you are now.
Before where I am now, after my doctorate, I took an academic position at the University of Texas at Tyler in 1978. And part of my role in that department was essentially beefing up the assessment. We trained in Texas master's level, so they were licensed as either marriage and family therapists or what's called licensed professional counselors, or actually licensed as psychological associates. These were people at the master's degree. So the program that I was involved in, that was the training we did. So I was actually in charge of expanding our assessment courses and expanding the training that our students received in how to do assessment. So I actually taught the courses from intelligence testing to achievement testing, and then I created in the 1980s the neuropsychological assessment courses and oversaw that. And then I would supervise our graduate students in their what's called internship or practicum training in overseeing the assessments they did. So I did that then, and I still do that. So over the years, we've expanded the assessments. In a clinic that I hadn't talked about, but a clinic I also oversaw, we would test out instruments for different publishers.
What does that mean?
Well, for example, the TSI, the Trauma Symptom Inventory, was developed in the 1980s by a psychologist named John Briere, who's at the University of Southern California. So we were a test site. Because we were trained in trauma and saw clients who had been traumatized, both offenders and victims, we would often be selected as a site where they could test out their tests. So we would administer them to clients that we saw or people that were involved in research with us, because we've done all those things. So we actually tested out the trauma symptom inventory, gave feedback to the person who was designing it, John, or Dr. Briere, sorry, and then they would make the revisions and test again. So we worked with that instrument before it was public knowledge, and then it actually got published by a professional test publisher, and then we've been using it ever since until they came out with an updated, newer version. So in our current program, we use quite a bit of testing even now when clients come to us or in forensic cases, and we train. So, for example, last week in...
Do you have recent experiences in using these instruments as of last week?
Yes.
Okay, what's that?
We do, part of our internship training program is we do trainings each week with all our staff, who are the clinical people, the interns, the postdoc. So last week, one of the trainings involved the use of trauma inventories and how do you score it, how do you interpret it. So we're constantly looking at new instruments and what's out there so that the people we're training have the best current knowledge of what we know about how to use different ways of assessing clients, children, adolescents, or adults. So we're continually doing those things.
Okay. And with regard to the testing, are there certain tests that have things that are called validity scales?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Let's talk about that for a second. What is a validity scale in general?
In general, when somebody takes...
Approach, please. Overruled.
So can you tell us in general about validity scales? What does that mean?
Validity scales are ways that tests themselves, some tests build in to check that the person is not trying to distort their responses. So validity scales mean you want to know if the person is being defensive and likely not willing to admit areas of potential problems, or are they lying? Are they actually trying to distort and give you incorrect responses? Or are they trying to look good or look bad on the test? So a lot of the instruments build in scales to test that out, because in order to interpret a test, you need to know that is it likely that this person answered in a relatively open and honest manner. If they did not, if they were so defensive and not willing to admit anything, or they were trying to, lie on this, then it invalidates the test. You don't interpret the test. You basically say the test isn't meaningful because I can't tell what the person was doing. So a lot of the tests now build in scales specifically to look for those things, and then after you determine that the test is valid, you can then interpret the various scales.
And how do these scales work? How can they tell if somebody is being defensive or lying about something?
Well, in general, without giving you information about the specific questions, one way is by you, in a long test, may have the same type of question asked different ways. And you look at whether the person at the beginning answered the questions the same they did at the end. There are certain things we know in psychology that tend to go together. So you might ask a person about some aspect of themselves and then ask them about another aspect, and we know in the research that those things should have the same answers. So that tells me if somebody's not willing to admit. So these scales actually look at a variety of ways to try to determine if the person is being relatively open and honest in responding to the test.
So it doesn't sound as simple as just answering a true or false and lying true or false and you just accepting the answers.
That is correct. It would not be a simple, especially with long tests, like one that has 567 questions. There's virtually no way a person could remember what they answered specifically about a question if they made it up, and something similar, an hour later in the test. So that's one of the ways it checks. Even on shorter tests, there are things that the research will show you that are very unlikely. So a person in a variety of settings or with a variety of symptoms, they're not likely to answer a particular question in a particular way. If they do, in my view, it's a red flag. It would escalate or elevate that validity scale, and it would tell the interpreter to be cautious when you're interpreting this result.
All right, and with regard to this case, did you review two trauma symptom inventory tests that Ms. Arias did?
Yes, I did.
And did you review a Milan MCMI test?
Yes.
And did you review an MMPI-2 test?
Yes.
And these tests were given by how many different providers? How many different people?
3 different mental health professionals.
And over what period of time? Do you know?
Over about a 2-year period.
Okay. And over that 2-year period, in all of these tests, do these particular tests have validity scales?
Those particular tests do, yes.
Okay. And in that 2-year time, with 3 different mental health professionals giving those tests to Ms. Arias, what did the validity scales tell us about her?
All those tests that had validity scales indicated that they were valid responses. In other words, 2 of the tests indicated no attempt at distortion, lying, or faking good or bad. 1 test indicated significant symptomatology. It didn't invalidate the test, but it indicated that the person was responding in a way that indicated lots of emotional and mental health issues. Another test indicated that at times it...
Which test?
Okay.
Sustained.
You can tell us which test you're referring to.
Sorry. The trauma symptom inventories, both versions...
Foundation, which one you reviewed too?
Sustained.
He's about to tell us. You reviewed 2 trauma symptom inventories, right?
Correct.
Okay. Are you speaking generally about the trauma TSI?
I was speaking about both of them. I was about to.
Okay. Go ahead.
Both trauma symptom inventories indicated that the validity scales were in the normal range. There are 3 scales on each test, and they were all within the normal range. The Milan, which is a personality type inventory, indicated that the tests were valid, but the person sometimes was answering in what's called in our language socially desirable ways. In other words, it was a little bit elevated in trying to make themselves look actually a little bit less problematic than they might be. The MMPI actually indicated that the person may be responding in a way that they might look a little bit more negative than they are. So all those were in the valid range, all within the normal range, but there's slight differences over the 2 years with the different tests.
And in any of those tests, is there any indication of her defensiveness, being defensive about answering?
There is a scale on the MMPI and on the others. Those were in the normal range at both tests, the MMPI and the MCMI.
Okay. And with regard to, you're familiar with the MMPI being given by, MMPI-2 being given by Dr. DeMarte, right?
Yes, I am.
And so in that particular validity scale, does it show, can we rely on the results in the MMPI?
The MMPI was considered a valid profile, but it also indicated that the person was reporting numerous symptoms of and issues on that particular instrument.
Does that invalidate it in any way?
No, it just tells you to be aware, essentially. It's like a caution that this person is expressing many symptoms, many issues that need to be explored.
And you said you reviewed 2 trauma symptom inventories, 2 TSI tests, right?
That is correct.
Do you know how far apart they were given
Yes.
from each other? How far apart?
A year and a half.
Okay, and anything with both of those validity scales showed that the tests were valid, is that right?
That is correct.
All right, let's talk first, maybe let's do the MMPI.
Yes, ma'am.
Why don't you tell us what it is?
It stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is the second version. It is probably the most common measure of personality characteristics in the field of mental health and psychology. It's probably the most researched measure around. It's a true-false test. It has 567 questions. It takes anywhere from an hour to an hour and 3/4 for somebody to take it. It requires about a 5th grade reading knowledge ability. And it gives you a lot of information. It's broken into what we call the Validity Scales, which we just talked about. It also has what's called Clinical Scales, which are general clinical issues like depression, anxiety, etc. And then it has, well, actually I haven't counted, probably 50 subscales to help explain what the other scales mean. And it helps say a clinical psychologist look for what might be going on with this particular person. In my language, it's like it gives you working hypotheses. When you assess somebody, you want to know what are you dealing with, and you form a hypothesis based on this. So the test by itself, you don't want to use to diagnose somebody, but it would provide information to guide you on what might be important to look for in trying to figure out what's going on with the person. You know, what are the different personality issues? And it breaks into numerous subscales.
Okay, well, let's take a look. I'm showing you Exhibit 631. This is the MMPI-2 that Dr. DeMarte conducted. The computer, is it a computer printout? How do you refer to this? It's computer scored, right?
Yes, well, the particular manufacturer of this test has the copyright, so they're the only ones who can computer score it, and because it has so many scales, you really don't want to do it by hand. I mean, we train our people on how so they know, but it could take you easily an hour just to score all those scales if you're using templates. So now you can score it with the computer by putting in the person's answers, and then you get a printout, and there's different printouts. This is called the Extended Score Report, which provides us all the scales, and then you can get interpretation reports and others. So this is the test that Dr. DeMarte administered and then is scored by the computer.
And you mentioned copyright. Is that what you're talking about at the bottom of the page?
Yes, Pearson is the company that has the copyright to this test, so it means two things. One is they're the only ones who are allowed to score this by computer, which was major lawsuits 10 years ago because others did it and they could not anymore. The other means somebody in my profession cannot give somebody else who's not a trained professional licensed psychologist copies of the raw data or the questions. So in other words, we're not allowed to release that because then it would defeat the purpose of the test.
How does it defeat the purpose of the test?
Well, if people knew what the exact questions and answers were and how that scores, then you could fake the test because then I would know, well, I don't want to answer this way or that way. So in all the tests that we're talking about, they all are copyrighted, meaning that we're only allowed to release the information to another licensed psychologist or trained mental health professional who then is also bound by not releasing it to others so that the confidentiality of the test itself is not breached. The profiles can be shared, but not the questions or how they actually get scored.
Okay, so what we're about to take a look at then has nothing to do with the raw data then?
Well, it's the results of it,
Yeah.
but it doesn't tell you the exact questions or things, which is acceptable.
Okay, so in other words, we're not going to see the 567 questions, right?
That is correct.
Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this. We're looking at page 2, the validity and clinical scales. So is this a representation of the validity scales on the left side here?
Yes, that is correct.
And we've discussed that already. So let's take onto the right side, what are we looking at here?
These are what are called the clinical scales, which is the major thing you look for diagnosis. And if you look at, well, I don't know how to do this, like the fifth.
There's a, on the top right-hand corner of your screen, there's like a little arrow.
Yes.
Do you see, if you touch that,
Yes.
it'll give you a little menu that you can use as an arrow if you want to
It
point
won't
to
break.
things.
Okay. All right. Now
So
what?
if you see the arrow underneath clear,
Yes.
if you push that, you can use it to point to things.
Oh, excellent. Do I move the arrow or I just touch something now?
Well, now just touch something.
Okay, so if you see this line here that says 50 across, that's average on this test. So it's what's called in the normal range. If you look up here, can I touch again?
Uh-huh.
Okay. If you look up here, this is 65. That's what is considered the clinical cutoff. So that means scales or scores above that 65 would be in the clinical range and things that we have to pay attention to. Also, just for diagnostic purposes, if you get things really low down here below the other way, it's something to pay attention to also in certain scales. So when you look at this particular test, you can see here and here and here. All these are obviously elevated above 65, and that's what I meant before when I said this test is giving you pretty significant symptomatology. It's indicating there's lots of different areas that this person is having difficulty with. And so you generally pick some of the high scales and then interpret it. But this when you look at this profile, it means that this person is displaying many symptoms in various areas of personality to explore.
Okay, and just so we all understand, at the bottom here we see T-score. Does that actually give us the numbers?
Yes, it does. These scores down here are what gets plotted up here. So if you see this one I just highlighted, it says 53, and if you look up here, that's where the dot is. So each of these scores down here are what ends up with that plot.
Okay, and so tell us then, you told us, so there's a number of elevations on this.
That is correct.
Okay. Have you ever heard or know about a term such as called a floating profile?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that is?
Floating profile was a term made up by psychologists a long, long time ago to indicate, well, it depends on who you talk to. They had different definitions. But the overall idea was somebody who had a lot of scales above this 65 or 70 they called it a floating profile. Some said you had 6 scales, some said 7, some said different numbers. But the idea was that there was a lot of scales above the 65 or 70 for the MMPI-1. And then they made and wrote up some articles on what it might mean. One of the more common ones that was written for quite a while, quite a bit of research actually, well not research, quite a few articles was actually written by a psychologist in Dallas, Robert Gatchell. And he originally wrote and published that this floating profile, lots of scales, was associated in his view, in his practice, with what was called borderline personality disorder. And that was published over, I guess his stuff was probably 8 or 9 years, different articles where he was talking about clinical practice. And then research actually started being done. The people who designed the MMPI, and they have lots of very thick books on how to interpret never talked about a floating profile, didn't think it was relevant, they never used the term, even in the books that were published while this was going on, none of the MMPI books refer to anything called a floating profile. So this is really by some of the people who are in clinical practice giving some of their impressions and some of the things they were associating with this type of profile.
That's what Dr. Gatchell was doing.
And some others, and yes.
Okay.
And then people started actually looking at the research. And so articles started coming out around 2006. Who actually studied. In other words, in the research arena, if somebody has an idea or a hypothesis, you actually study it. So they actually then administered tests to people who had borderline personality and disorder and were diagnosed with that and others, and they did not find any significant association. So articles began to be published around 2006 that said, you know, the research doesn't support any type of thing called a floating profile in order to predict something else. In fact, they said, according to the research, the MMPI was not good at predicting borderline personality disorder or such things as post-traumatic stress disorder or other things. It was designed, and what it was good for was telling you about the person's personality. And so they basically said there is no such thing as a floating profile. And so Dr. Gatchell himself started to focus more on chronic pain people and came out with articles, and his colleagues in about 2008 or so, basically saying that the floating profile really wasn't valid and he wasn't using it, and he realized that it really isn't a floating profile, it was really what he termed a disability profile and seemed to be more associated with chronic pain and things like that. So somebody who's reporting numerous symptoms like you see here might be somebody that's associated with either significant personality issues or symptoms or pain, and then he started focusing on a pain population, which is completely separate. And so that term pretty well disappeared in 2008 as the research made it clear that it wasn't useful, it wasn't substantiated.
So is that a term that you use then?
No. In fact, I've never used that term, never trained on it. I mean, I've heard about it, but it was never really researched, so I didn't pay much attention. But when...
Sustained.
So you said you never really trained on it. Is that because there was not a lot of actual research supporting it to begin with?
Correct. Oh, sorry.
You can answer.
Oh. Yeah, yes, because there was no substantiation of that, so we never trained others about it. I pretty well never paid attention to it until it came up in this case.
Okay. Now, when you have somebody who has multiple elevated scales, like we see here, is it common to take the top 2 or 3?
When you're doing interpretation, yes, it's called a code type, so you usually do that, and the research indicates that that there's a relationship between certain scales and somebody's personality, especially if they have 1 or 2 or possibly 3 scales that are elevated. That's a little bit different to do when you have several scales elevated.
Okay. If we took the top 3 scales here, is it something that can support a personality that is aggressive, defensive, hostile, or holds their emotions inside? If you're looking at this.
Those would be working hypotheses. In other words, theoretically, somebody who had those characteristics could end up with a profile like this. That would be something that would be to explore. So if we said, well, boy, this is, a pretty major profile, and we think, for example, that, well, maybe we have somebody who does have borderline personality, or we have somebody who's very hostile and aggressive, then the next steps would be, well, let's look at those subscales and see what they say. That would be the next step in how you use a test like this.
Okay, so the rest of these, there's several other, we look at several other charts showing the subscales, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and these are something that you use, right?
Definitely.
Okay, let's take a look at page 5. Can you tell us what scale is it showing us?
Well, these are several. They're called content scales, but you have several different things. If you see at the bottom, I'll try that. You see these are terms that define different things. So, for example, this is anxiety. Again, A and X. And again, it's the same. So if you look here, normal is 50. Clinical cutoff would be 65. And so you would look at some of these scales. So if we had a hypothesis, for example, that the person was hostile, aggressive, controlling, or things like that, then the way to do this is to then look at those scales and see what they show. That way you have an idea of whether your hypothesis might be correct or not. And if it's not, well, what are other hypotheses? And then you would check those out.
Okay, so let's go with the hypothesis of somebody who's aggressive, defensive, hostile, holds their emotions inside. What do you see? Do you see anything on these content scales?
Well, there are two scales you would look at in this particular graph. This one here is called, well, I didn't mean to cover it up, but it's anger. If we said somebody who's angry, hostile, and all that.
That's A and G?
That's A and G. Okay. Well, so we look at that scale, and then you go up here and you see, well, it's right in the middle of the normal range. This person is not, even though they're displaying many symptoms, it doesn't appear that they're an angry person. That doesn't mean the person can't get angry. We all can get angry. But it means basically that this is not part of their personality. That would be one thing you would look at. Okay. Another would be, say, antisocial practices, that they're doing this on a regular basis. That would be this one here.
Is that ASP?
Correct. And you can see that's also in the normal range. So for your working hypothesis that you mentioned, those would be two of the scales that you would look at here.
Okay.
And then you would look at others on other pages.
All right, let's take a look at, well, so right now what we're seeing with anger and antisocial practices, we're seeing them in the normal range.
That is correct.
Okay. So let's take a look at page 6. All right, and does page 6 tell us anything? If we're looking at this hypothesis of aggression and hostility, does it, and the other things, what does page 6, the scales on page 6 tell us?
Well, there's 3 scales here that look at those particular dimensions that you would want to look at. One is this one over here, which is called DO, dominance. Does the person have a need to control and dominate other people? And this particular profile is way below average, meaning that it's likely the opposite. Instead of this person being dominant, this person is more passive, submissive when you have that low. So that's one scale.
Okay.
Another one is this one, which is, well, there we go, HO, which is hostility. Is this person overall a hostile person? And you can see that's roughly in the average range here. And then the next one is OH here, which is called over-controlled hostility. In other words, do they have a lot of hostility inside that is either spending a lot of energy keeping inside or trying to control it or things like that. And you can see that's within the normal range also. So those would be 3 of the scales on this particular supplemental scale profile that you would look at for that hypothesis.
Okay. And let's take a look at page 7. These are the Psi-5 scales, right?
Yes.
Okay. And with regard to the Psi-5 scales, does it tell us anything about our hypothesis for aggression and hostility?
This first scale is actually termed an aggressiveness scale.
Okay.
It is actually looking at, is this person have an aggressive personality? Are they aggressive in general? And this is showing, again, significantly below average, which then would lead you to a hypothesis that instead of being aggressive, this person is a personality. That doesn't, again, mean that somebody can't act aggressively at times, but what it means is as a personality, say a trait or part of them is actually more submissive, more passive.
Okay. And anything else on this page?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So based on all the scales that we just looked at, then, what does it tell us about our hypothesis for aggression, hostility, and over-controlled hostility, or holding your emotions inside?
Those would say that that's not likely a good hypothesis to have, and you may need to look for other hypotheses.
Okay. What if you, after interviewing somebody, doing clinical interviews, you have a hypothesis or you have an understanding that they were involved in an abusive relationship, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
And you develop a hypothesis that the person may have PTSD or some type of anxiety.
Yes, ma'am.
Would there be scales on the MMPI-2 that we can look at for that hypothesis?
Yes, there are.
Okay. So shall we flip back to page 5?
Yes, that would be fine.
Okay. All right, so we're looking at page 5. So with our new hypothesis, what do we look at on page 5?
Well, now you're looking at somebody, if in your hypothetical, who might be traumatized, have PTSD, be a victim of some type of a trauma or abuse. So now what you look at is anxiety. So this first scale here, we mentioned before, we weren't talking about this hypothesis, but we mentioned, which is an anxiety scale. And it's significantly elevated, as you can see up here. So that would be one of the things we would look at on that. Another one would be self-esteem. The hypothesis is that somebody who's been traumatized or in an abusive relationship, it would possibly affect their view of themselves. It would lower their self-esteem. So there's a scale right here called LSE, which is low self-esteem, and you can see this is elevated in the significant area, meaning this person does have lower self-esteem than is either healthy or normal. So those would be two particular scales you would look at on this particular chart.
Okay, and I just want to make sure, so when we talk about low self-esteem here, and it's elevated, that means the person has lower self-esteem than normal.
Correct. So it's
Okay.
just like, because it says low self-esteem, higher numbers mean lower. It's like an inverse relationship. So the higher the scale, the lower the self-esteem is. Just like here, anger, the higher the scale, the more anxiety they have. So this is what we call in our language inverse. It's reverse scoring. So that means the higher it is, the lower the self-esteem is. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right, so let's try page, is that it for this particular scale?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let's take a look at page 6, and we're looking at the supplementary scales.
Yes.
Now, with our new hypothesis, with PTSD or anxiety, what do we look at here?
Well, again, this A is another way of measuring anxiety. So there's a variety of things. Pardon?
I'm sorry, that's down here at the first?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. So that is another way, and it is, you can see, is showing you a significant elevation. I'm not doing this real well. I keep covering the dots. Okay, so in any case, that shows you significant elevations and anxiety. You also, again, using your working hypothesis of somebody from an abusive relationship, then you're going to hypothesize that they're going to not only be, well, I'm saying that double negative, they're not going to be controlling, they're going to be the opposite. They're going to be more submissive if they've been traumatized in an abusive relationship. So they're likely to be the opposite. And that was the dominance we measured, or we talked about. Right next to it is ES, which is ego strength. In other
What's
words,
ego strength?
Ego strength is a way of not only measuring self-image, self-esteem, but ego strength means how you feel about yourself overall. And the research is pretty consistent. Somebody who's been in, say, who's been suffering from PTSD, they usually internalize that, whether we're talking about a hypothetical of an abused victim or somebody coming out of combat. So they feel a lot of internalized guilt and self-blame, and that lowers their ego strength and self-esteem. And you can see their ego strength is way below average. It's near the bottom of that scale. So that would be another red flag, and that's the term I use, that so far we are consistent with that working hypothesis.
Of what?
Of somebody who's either been traumatized or possibly in an abusive relationship or something along those lines.
Okay. What does R mean?
Repression. That's whether somebody is trying to block out unpleasant thoughts or feelings or events. So that's not in the clinical range, but it's above average. But it's not elevated like some of the other scales.
Okay. And is there any other scales on here that we'd want to look at?
Yes, ma'am.
What else?
This PK scale right here, that is the one actual measure of trauma that this test does. If you remember before when I was talking about the research, it indicates that the MMPI is really not on its own a predictor of like a personality disorder or PTSD, but it will give you working hypotheses. So this is the one scale that actually looks at post-traumatic stress disorder, and you can see how high up that is. It was actually the highest scale. So again, that would be consistent with our working hypothesis, or at least it says that needs to be explored in more detail.
Okay. And so when you say explored in more detail, I take it you're not telling us because the PK or the PTSD scale on here, because it's high, we know for sure she has PTSD, right? That's not...
No, that's not what I'm saying. It is not appropriate to take any one test and diagnose a person based on that. These, for the lack of better words, these are working hypotheses. This is giving the clinician a guide that these things either may or may not be correct, and you need to explore further with other tests, with interviews, with collateral records, with whatever, to try to verify that. And there's one other one I missed there, by the way, and I forgot what scale it's on. But another area that would be part of our working...
There's lack of foundation. Which scale?
Did you miss one that is supportive of the working hypothesis?
Yes.
Which one is that you missed?
It's called fears. Another one, it's on...
Could we have that marked, please?
Are you reviewing your own copy of this?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And does that help you to see it there versus having to look at the screen?
Yeah, yes, that's acceptable.
I'd ask that we not have to mark it. It's the same item.
I would ask that it be marked. He's looking at it and not what's on the...
All right, we're going to take a break in about 5 minutes, and at that time I will let the prosecutor look at the exhibit or the witness's notes.
Okay.
And we'll decide if it needs to be marked at that time.
Okay.
Continue.
So we're looking back at the content scales. Is that where we see fears?
Yes, that's what I skipped, and I apologize, I didn't mean to. But one of the other things we would look at is fears, which is over here, and it's not in the clinical range, but it is above average.
All right, and you're referring to what it says FRS, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And it's not in the clinical range, so why would you look at it?
Well, again, we're looking at things that might contradict our hypothesis, so either one way or the other. So if, for example, this fears was way down here and below average, then that would be somewhat contradictory, and we'd have to try to explain why. So when you don't have consistent results, then if everything is consistent in one way or another that says yes or no, you can either discard it if it doesn't match. If it's consistent yes, then you go further. But if you have inconsistent findings, let's say half the tests I just showed you show significant elevations and the other half do not, then you have to try to figure out why. That's what diagnostic assessment is to try to explain what is going on. When I do the training, I look at these things and I train people on viewing it like a jigsaw puzzle. Your job as a clinician is to put the puzzle together. So I'm trying to decide what is going on with a person. I need to know what the picture is, and so I need all these pieces of the puzzle to fit together to finally get what the picture is. So I can't decide, for example, I don't like this part and I'm going to throw it out. That's like throwing out a piece of the puzzle, and it could be a significant piece, so I don't know what the picture looks like. So I have to figure out how all these pieces of the puzzle fit together in order to eventually come up with a diagnosis.
So even though we see fears above normal but below clinical, is that still a piece of the puzzle for you?
Yes, so I mean, it's still in the direction. It doesn't, again, it's not something I would harp on. It's not something I would go overboard on. I would say right now, based on this test only, that you do have some consistent findings that would need to be explored.
Okay, and the consistent findings that need to be explored are consistent with what?
Anxiety, trauma.
Okay. And what does the research tell us about the MMPI-2 diagnosing borderline?
It could only be used really as, again, a working hypothesis. So you would look at some of the scales we did, but it would really say that if you think you do have, say, from whatever reason, a borderline personality, then you need to explore further. So this particular test is not designed and has never been designed to measure personality disorders. It's designed to do what we just did, looking at overall personality. It's also not designed to really assess trauma. It would give you some ideas that you'd have to explore further if you're doing it correctly.
All right. And so if we're going to explore further, let's say a hypothesis of borderline, what might be another test that you would want to see?
The test you would look at would be what's called the Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory, and I did not name it.
Okay.
It's the MCMI. That is the test that is specifically designed to look at personality disorders.
Okay. And Judge, that's probably a good time for a break then.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, please try to limit your break to approximately 10 minutes. Let's say 10:45. Please remember the admonition. You are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
Counsel, please approach.